At Panasonic, we build technologies that turn complex data into smarter decisions, helping you prepare for what's next. We're building the future so you can lead it. Panasonic. Create today, enrich tomorrow.
Breathe deep. Imagine your legs more limber in Duluth Trading Double Flex Denim. Envision euphorically squatting for that can of suds, bending for your toolbox in a state of bliss, lunging for your laser level on a whole new level. Relax and allow the flex to fill you with ability. Find your inner flex in Double Flex Denim only at Duluth Trading.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is David Garland, the Arthur Vanderbilt Professor of Law and Professor of Sociology at New York University. He's the author of multiple books, including the recently released Law and Order Leviathan, America's Extraordinary Regime of Policing and Punishment, which we'll be discussing today. David Garland, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I like to start with titles because authors choose them for a reason, and yours, Leviathan, that doesn't sound like a nice, friendly sort of thing. So why Leviathan?
So the book's topic is that the remarkable, I'd say extraordinary American penal state, basically our regime of policing and punishment in this country, is much more extensive, much more intensive than any other developed high-income nation. So what I'm trying to convey with the title is the sense that the American penal state is, like Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, this powerful, authoritarian regime that kind of emerges out of a situation where, in the Hobbesian story, basically the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, and people collectively make a social contract and create a state to protect them. Well, there's some kind of similar processes going on in the USA, that the levels of violence, the level of disorder, concerns about victimization in the 70s, 80s, and 90s led to this remarkable penal state, just like a monstrous Leviathan as described by Hobbes.
And I think some people would say, or would feel that it's kind of a paradox because the United States is certainly a rich country that a lot of people see as this kind of beacon of freedom, and yet we have this deeply punitive justice system. But in the book, you actually say, well, that's not really all that paradoxical. And I was hoping you could explain that.
So America is certainly a very rich country, maybe the richest country the world's ever known, but it's not a very equal country. In fact, amongst the developed nations, it's one of the most unequal economically and racially. And similarly, it is a beacon of liberty and freedom, but there are different kinds of liberty, different kinds of freedoms. And the one that's emphasized and most fully established in this country is market freedom, the economic liberty to pursue profit as you wish with minimal regulation. Political freedom and political liberty in the sense that, as Berlin talked about, is positive freedom, the sense that we enable people through provision of social rights or entitlements to live the fullest life that they can. That kind of freedom is not well developed in this country. So the apparent paradox that how could it be that a rich free nation had this extraordinary penal state and incarcerates and polices so aggressively, that's less of a paradox than it seems at first sight.
I think another thing some folks might say is that, well, sure, our incarceration rate is fairly high, more than fairly high, but you have to understand that Americans, part of being such a vibrant culture means that we're also more violent than most other democracies. And so therefore, there's nothing wrong with our penal system. It's just responding to the reality of what you might call the dark side of the American character that brings us so much energy and innovation. Violence is just part of that. What do you think about that argument?
So I think that there are many vibrant cultures around the world that are much less violent than this one. I think that basically the point that you make, that in some respects the extraordinary penal system with our very high rates of incarceration and very aggressive policing is responding to very high rates of violence. That's true. And we have homicide rates which have been reducing for some time, but they're still 5 to 10 times higher than the homicide rates of other developed nations. So what I want to explain is both American penal state and America's kind of incarceration and policing practices, but also I try and explain America's levels of violence. What is it that means? What is it that produces homicide levels and armed robbery levels that are off the charts in comparison to other nations? And the argument I make in the book is that there's something about the political economy, there's something about the gun culture that together create these levels of violence and this particular penal response to them.
Well, let's dig in a little bit more to those two things, especially because that's the next thing some folks would say. Certainly a lot of folks on the left would say, well, you'd have a lot fewer homicides if we didn't have more guns than people in this country. And I assume that's a big part of the story, right?
It is a big part of the story. There are, if we subtract gun homicides and look only at homicides with fists and knives and so on, America's homicide rate is much lower than otherwise, but it's still higher than the European averages, that of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So leaving aside gun homicides, our homicide rates are still high. Adding in gun homicides, our rates are off the charts, basically. So there's clearly an multiplier, amplifying effect that comes from having guns in such circulation, in such ready availability.
And so that would mean that if you take guns out of the picture, as it were, and our rates are still significantly higher, that would probably implicate that second factor you talked about a little bit, sort of what American-style capitalism has to do with our penal system. And that's like, can you talk about that connection as you see it?
So that's what the book's about. So there are many strands to that argument, how it is that the American political economy creates this American penal state. But there's a variety of connections. One is that the American economic arrangement, political arrangement that we have, allows working people, but especially people out of work, to be immiserated and to have, as it were, poorer conditions of living than is true anywhere else in the developed world. In addition to that, we have segregated communities, which are by and large racially segregated. That's to say, very poor people living together in this country are typically black people. There are white ghettos too, but they are rarely as extensive and as deeply impoverished as black ones. These neighborhoods tend to be socially disorganized. They tend to have very poor housing, very little in the way of jobs and income, very little in the way of good schools. They don't have the social capital and the social organization that comes from community life elsewhere. In that context, illegal behavior and violent behavior tend to flourish. So we've produced levels of violence as a consequence of a way of providing people with work or depriving them of work, and a way of providing them with decent housing conditions and living conditions. Secondly, the character of the state and the capacities of the state in this country, we aren't set up to provide much in the way of social welfare and social rights and public provision. By and large, the federal and state and local governments are designed to maximize market processes and to minimize the extent of welfare state provision. In addition to that, the responsible unit of government that deals with crime is primarily local government. Police departments, there are 15,000 of them, are typically small. They're typically paid for by local property taxes, similarly with jails and courts and so on. What that means is that at the level of government responsible for dealing with the crime problem primarily, there's very little capacity and little resources to do so. So what we end up doing is the cheap options, namely policing and punishing. And finally, I think that something to do with the American political economy, to do with class relations and race relations, and the kind of everyone for himself ethos of a market economy, is there's a great deal of indifference and a real lack of solidarity across the nation. That's not to say that groups don't have their own in-group solidarities, but by and large, concern for others who are other Americans is often very limited if these other Americans are people of color, if they're black, but particularly if they are criminal, if they're convicted, if they're arrested, if they're viewed as being somehow or other bad other people, then the idea of incarcerating them doesn't seem a problem to many Americans.
I think some people would, on the local control issue, would say, Well, sure, the resource issue is definitely a problem. But on the other hand, local control means that certain jurisdictions can experiment with things. It's a whole argument for federalism. Like, let's say one jurisdiction decides that cashless bail is a good thing. Well, they can try that and see how it works. And that sort of positive experimentation can filter out. And what do you think about that argument? Is it that just the resource constraints overwhelm that sort of potential positive, or what?
So I do agree with you that federalism and local control of various governmental undertakings allows for variation, for sure, and experimentation, and sometimes kind of progress against the background of reaction. And that's the case. I mean, there's a lot of difference between northeastern states and midwestern and southern states in terms of when it comes to styles of policing or levels of incarceration or levels of welfare provision even. But one of the things that's remarkable about the law and order story is that despite the possibility of different directions and different politics in different parts of the country, from about 1980 onwards, there was a more or less uniform trend whereby local government, state governments, as well as federal administrations, whether they were Democrat or Republican, moved in the direction of more and more law and order. So although levels of incarceration are much higher in Louisiana, for example, than they are in Maine or Minnesota, all of the states moved in the same direction of incarcerating more, policing more aggressively, sentencing more extensively, and so on. And that, I think, has been a story of a national uniform trend, even if the rates of policing incarceration vary within the country. I should add to that even though there is a great deal of variation between, say, Maine and Minnesota on the one hand and Louisiana and Georgia on the other hand, the most lenient American states are still much more penal than the European nation comparisons.
I think when I think about policing and incarceration in America, the history of it, once we get to maybe Nixon in the 70s, I start to think about the whole war on drugs thing and so forth. And something like, if my figures are correct, something like a fifth of all people imprisoned in the U.S. are in prison for drug offenses, and most of those are nonviolent drug offenses. And so I'm wondering, is the American response to drugs somehow unique or uniquely punitive here?
So you're right that in the federal prisons, which count for about 10% of people incarcerated, almost half of those in custody are there for some drug kind of offense. In state prisons, it's about 16%. That's a very high number because, of course, the magnitude of these populations is very high. It was actually more egregious in the 1980s and 1990s. The war on drugs has been to some extent scaled back since the 1990s. It was higher before. The number of people in prison for drug offenses is lower now. I think it does express a number of things. First of all, of course, it expresses the fact that in the USA, people with drug problems, people often are self-medicating with drugs, are rarely provided with health care, are really provided with alternative forms of therapy or assistance when they need help with drugs. We tend to use a penal mechanism. We tend to police and to incarcerate in that kind of way. But I think that in the past, there's been a kind of project on the part of the authorities that drugs were often a way of getting at other kinds of offending. In other words, it was very difficult often to get people to come forward as witnesses or to catch people red-handed when they committed violent acts, when they shot others, when they murdered others, when they robbed others. So the violence problem was one that was difficult to police and difficult to prosecute. If, on the other hand, you used as a proxy possession of drugs, then there was a way of getting at these violent offences, violent criminals, and, as it were, arresting and convicting them on some other basis that was a strict liability. If you're found in possession, you're assumed to be guilty. The problem with that was that the original idea that you would use drugs as a proxy to get at violent crime, to get at drug czars, to get at people who were actually, carrying out armed robberies or murders around the drug market. That original plan was kind of left behind in an interesting story. Basically, at first, when drug laws were passed with this in mind, the police had very little incentive and very little interest in enforcing them. In other words, the local police would say, well, for example, in New York State, the Rockefeller drug laws were passed in the 1970s with large-scale penalties for drug use. And the police kind of shrugged their shoulders up. Why would we enforce these? We've got serious crime to deal with. So then what happened is that the federal government began to incentivize local policing. It began to provide federal funds in return for engaging in drug use, in drug law enforcement. It began to allow forfeiture so that anything that the local police would actually apprehend in the middle of a drug bust, they could keep and they could utilize for their own resource purposes. That kind of thing incentivized the enforcement of drug laws and actually extended it much further than the original plan, so that in the end, police departments were sweeping up low-level drug users and low-level drug sellers who weren't particularly violent and arresting and incarcerating them because they were incentivized to do so. Now, that by itself produced an enormous racial disparity because white people, black people, Hispanic people probably do illegal drugs in something like similar proportions. But poor black people are much more available to the police because they're buying and selling drugs in the street as opposed to buying it in Wall Street, in the suites or in university dormitories and so on. So enforcement of drug laws tended to be heavily racialized. And in the 1980s, 1990s, this became a bit of a scandal. And in the 1990s, you began to see the scaling back of the war on drugs, with the consequence that racial disparities in jails and prisons have actually reduced over time, at the same time as the number of people serving time for drug offenses has been reduced.
And if you said racial disparities have been reduced, but there still, is a pretty big disparity. I think something like a little bit under 40% of the U.S. prison population is black, when black people make up only around 13% of the U.S. population. And a lot of folks on the left will see that and say, well, this points to sort of a systemic institutional racism. But folks on the right, a lot of times when you ask them about this, will say, well, no, the real problem is social dysfunction, the absence of black fathers in families. Something like under 40% of black children in the U.S. live in two-parent homes, and it's almost double or nearly double that for white children. And can you talk a little bit more about the race aspect of this?
Sure. I do this extensively in the book, and it's a topic for careful analysis and presentation because it's so emotive and it's so typically polarized in discussion, and I try and do this in the book. So basically, if there's undoubtedly racial bias in enforcement and in the practice of police and in courts, prosecution and sentencing and so on, but that isn't the whole story by any means. There's differential involvement in different kinds of crime. In particular, the involvement by black offenders, usually against black victims, with respect to homicide is clearly a phenomenon. And that accounts for the fact that more of the people who are arrested and charged and convicted of homicides turn out to be black than is the case in terms of the proportion of their demographic in the population. I mentioned already that the drug offending, there the story was not that blacks or people of color were offending more. The story was that the enforcement practices of local police made it easier to apprehend and arrest and convict poor black people than it was to convict better off white people who were also doing the same kind of offending. So there's disparity in involvement, there's disparity of enforcement too. But one of the things that's it is vital for us to think about is that a lot of crime occurs in socially disorganized neighborhoods. It occurs in places where the informal social controls of family and of neighbors and of work and of schools are not functioning effectively to bind young people into law-abiding ways, to keep them in school, to get them to jobs, to having families and being respectable and law-abiding. That disorganization, that level of impoverishment and segregation and cumulative disadvantage, that's a big part of the story here. That's a story about political economy, and it's a story about race. So basically, the book tries to show that the generation of criminal behavior, whether it's violent behavior, drug offender, or property offending, that is already patterned by a racialized political economy in this country. And therefore, it's no wonder that poor black people are more involved in crime than better off white people are. Family functioning is a big part of that story. The difficulty of functioning when there's no work when there's real stress in the household, there's not enough resources to deal with children or to supervise kids. These are problems that are exacerbated for the poorest people in our society. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to show where these problems come from, why it's not the case that individuals or individual parents are responsible for the fate, but at the same time to kind of put that in a context where actually the interaction between social conditions, families, individual conduct is a complicated human story that we need to understand more detail.
Sweat moves you forward. Degree Antiperspirant is here to make sure it never holds you back. Clocking in, sweat. Lunch meeting, sweat. Biking home, sweat. Degree Advanced is for the hustlers who put in the sweat. The world's #1 antiperspirant with up to 72-hour sweat and odor protection. Degree, here for sweat. Try it today.
Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original, which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
I was thinking about a lot of stuff. I looked up a number of statistics about violent crime over time in preparation to talk with you. And it seems weird to me. In the early 90s, we kind of hit our peak in violent crime in the U.S. and it's around 758 crimes per 100,000. Today, the rate is less than half of that, but our incarceration rate somehow was actually increased. In the early 90s, it was like 457 per 100,000. Now it's 541 per 100,000, give or take. That just seems to not make sense to me. Can you help me make sense of that?
Sure. Well, there's a kind of complicated story here, and there's more kind of trending and patterns than you've described in the question. But so basically, in the 1990s, up to 1994, the homicide level in this country was something like 10 per 100,000. It's fallen since to something closer to 6 per 100,000. And that's a massive decline in the number of people who are murdered. Partly it's got to do with improved medical response, but partly it's got to do with the actual reduction in the number of shootings and so on. Even after that long decline, the US is still like 6 to 10 times higher in its homicide rates than we are. So we can congratulate ourselves, but we're not kind of there yet in terms of being a safe society. But you're right to say that the homicide level and armed robbery and crime generally has tended to decline from the 90s. And yet our incarceration rates are higher than they were then. How could that be? Well, first of all, the incarceration rates are actually falling from the 2008 peak that they had. Basically, in 2008, the rate was something like 750 per 100,000. There were about 2.3 million people in custody at that time. Now we've got fewer than 2 million, and the rate's closer to 550. So basically, we've seen a trending down since 2008. How could it be, though, that we have more people in prison today than we had in the 1990s when homicide rates were higher? Well, the answer is kind of simple. Basically, prison is an accumulation story. It's about a stock of people that have been admitted to prison and stay there for long periods of time. We know that in this country, the length of prison sentences is often very long, especially for violent crime. People are serving 15, 20, sometimes life incarceration without parole. So they might commit their crime in the 1990s or in 2000. They're still in prison today, right? So basically, you don't begin to see changes in prison population occurring until a long time delay after the trend in prison admissions. So what you should look at is the number of people admitted to prison each year, not the number of people who are actually there each year. It's a stock and flow story.
Right. Okay. I think there are some folks who would say, though, that the decline is actually a problem, and that there's this view that, well, criminals should be behind bars, and if anything, we need to put away a lot more bad guys. Let's talk about, well, let's revive Alcatraz, and as President Trump mentioned, we need more prisons, we need tougher prisons, and yeah, I'm sure you've encountered a lot of folks who have that view of our penal system. If we were just tougher on criminals, we'd have less crime. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, the having less crime is a feature of nearly all the other democratic nations and all the other high-income nations. They didn't get there by incarcerating everyone. They got there by having social arrangements and economic arrangements that make it easier for people to live law-abiding lives. If we're incarcerating a large number of people, we can see that as being the only solution available, a good solution, or one solution amongst others that we could choose, right? The fact that many people see a large number of people incarcerated as being just fine suggests that there are some limitations to solidarity in this country. The idea that we should have citizens, other Americans, spending time behind bars in regimes. One of the things I describe in the book is that prison regimes, jail regimes in this country are actually much less decent and decently provided than is the case in other countries. So we have harsh prisons, and we have large numbers of people sending long sentences there. Should we be fine with that as a country? Should we think of that as being a good set of arrangements? Or might we think that actually that describes some social failures and pathologies that we could do better with? These are questions that I don't deal with in the book. These are normative issues. What I'm trying to do in the book is give social scientific explanations for why these arrangements exist. Other people can read the book and decide for themselves what the normative responses should be.
I guess my response is, maybe this is my sort of leftiness coming out a little bit, I don't know. But just as a practical matter, it seems to me that prison should be a last resort, because if you put someone in prison, you, to a certain extent, wreck their life and make it more likely they're going to have a more disordered life, and make it more likely you're just creating a cycle of crime. So just from a very pragmatic perspective, I don't understand it. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something here. What do you think about that? That's my take on it. I don't know.
So I don't disagree with anything you just said. But basically, prisons are themselves criminogenic in the sense that people do experience training in how to commit crimes when they're there. They meet other people who are also offenders. They kind of they have less prospect afterwards of learning, of earning a living, of being kind of, as you say, integrated into family life and so on. So prisons by and large can exacerbate rather than deal with the problem of a crime. That's one reason why in this country that the standard prison sentence is so extensive and so long. The idea is, well, we can incapacitate people by just keeping them off the streets for very long periods of time. To that extent, we reduce the crime problem in the streets, but we increase the crime problem in prisons. It's what you were describing is other ways of dealing with crime problems than the ones that have been chosen in this country. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is explain why the choices were made and why people embrace them where other choices could be available. So the normative point you make, I would embrace myself. I think partly the issue is, where does the problem of crime come from? What are the variety of ways available to deal with it? Prison might be the last resort and the least effective one.
I think way back at the very beginning of my career as a political scientist, I did some work on attributions of responsibility for crime in popular culture. And since that time, I've always felt that a big part of the reason where we're so law and order and crime oriented is we have this mistaken view about crime that just our cities are awash in crime and that they're super violent cesspools. And to me, a lot of it maybe is driven by what we see on television or true crime podcasts. It just seems like there's crime everywhere on our screens. And I feel like it gives people a really false sense of how dangerous life in America is. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
So it is all relative. Life in America is very dangerous in comparison with life in Norway or Sweden or England or Australia. That's to say, more people are robbed, more people are shot, more people are killed. The extent to which that occurs may be exaggerated in culture. It may be the case that if you watch cop shows or if you listen to the sensational reporting on the evening news, you'll have an exaggerated sense of that. But I would say that the focus on crime and procedurals and law and order stories, that's pretty general in the developed world today. I mean, I come from Britain. I lived there. I've lived in other places too. Basically, there's a lot of crime and control in the culture everywhere. It doesn't typically lead to levels of violence and levels of gun crime and so on that we see in this country. So I wouldn't blame the culture. I do think that if you're watching on the evening news and you see local events that involve robberies or involve shootings or involve homicide, then you're liable to be much more responsive to law and order politics. So of the various things you described there, some of them are dramas and some of them are entertainment. the local evening news is a place where people do get some sense of how safe or unsafe their neighborhoods are. And one of the places where the kind of politics of law and order does get its energy from. So I agree with that. But by and large, this is remarkable. So news stories are always sensationalized. They always go for the dramatic lead. Nevertheless, the representation of crime in evening news, in news broadcasts, tends to track the levels of crime that are out there. In other words, the newsmakers are responsive to the level of problems that they're finding out in the community. They sensationalize and exaggerate them, but it tends to track. So interestingly, after the 1990s, when you saw the big decline in homicides and armed robberies, crime tended to lessen its presence in news items, in news broadcasts and so on. And over the same period of time, people got less enthusiastic about locking people up, and people began to be concerned about, well, maybe we're locking too many people up. And one of the interesting things in the early 2000s has been the extent to which people have been concerned about mass incarceration and maybe some of the negatives involved there, and maybe thinking about reducing the amount of resources that are spent on incarcerating people. I mean, one of the most interesting features of the early 21st century was the extent to which right-wing neoliberals, people who were concerned about we should tax too many people, we tax people too much, we have too much government, they began to get interested in the prison system as being, a big government program that needed to be cut back too. So the kind of right-on crime movement, I think, was really enabled by the reduction in crime rates that occurred.
Throughout our conversation, we've, at least you've alluded to other countries and how the United States is different. I think for a lot of listeners, because most listeners to the Politics Guys are American, and it can maybe be difficult for us to appreciate how different other systems are. And so I was hoping to bring in some international context. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how the U.S. compares with, say, Western Europe, Canada, Japan, kind of our peer sort of countries, as it were, when it comes to things like incarceration rates and policing and that sort of thing?
Right, for sure. So across the board on all these variables, whether it's the levels of homicide, whether it's the levels of police killings, whether it's the number of people incarcerated, the USA is really an outlier. The USA is off to one side and different from all the others. Incarceration rates in the USA up to about 2008, incarceration rates were about 700 per 100,000. In other words, for every 100,000 people in the population, 700 of them were in prison or jail at any one time. In Europe, in Western Europe, the rate is about 100,000. I beg your pardon, the rate is 100 per 100,000.
Wow.
So 7 times as many people being incarcerated in the USA per capita. Scandinavian nations are about 50 to 60 per 100,000. England, Scotland, Canada, more like 140 per 100,000, but we're 700. So that number is way higher than ever. The number of homicides, I mentioned this already in the podcast, 5 to 10 times as high as any other nation in the Western developed world. When it comes to police killings, the number of citizens killed on the streets in the USA every year. First of all, that number was never counted officially until quite recently. And today, it's only journalists that keep count of police killings, but they try to do so pretty assiduously. And what we know is that there's about 1,000 Americans killed each year by the police. It's also the case that many police officers are themselves killed in the line of duty. But other nations have nothing like that level of police killings, nothing like it. And of course, you've got to understand that in the context of a gun culture. You've got to understand that also in the context where precisely because people are concerned about violent crime, they tend to make the police much less accountable. The public, politicians, the courts, all of them give police officers in this country a much longer leash than is the case elsewhere. Because in some sense, there's, well, we have serious crime. We have to have the police deal with it. Offenders are armed. The police need to be armed too. Somebody's going to get shot. Let's hope it's the offenders, not passers-by. That kind of mentality is an American one. In Britain, where I'm from, Canada, New Zealand, and Western Europe, the police are not armed all the time. And police shootings of civilians is very rare. The police killings by civilians is also very rare. So the US is, in all these senses, extraordinary.
And is there, when you look at how these countries deal with crime and punishment compared to how the United States does, is there anything that stands out where you say, well, the U.S. should really learn a lesson, could take a lesson from these countries? What kind of jumps out?
So the argument of the book really is that the basic thing is not the manipulation of penal power and the decisions about criminal justice. The basic thing is the social and economic background that's been put in place in the American style of governing the economy, American style capitalism, as compared to Canadian or Australian, but especially as compared to German or Dutch or Nordic arrangements. Basically, our political economy, our way of governing economic action, our way of establishing a labor market, our way of employing workers, our way of providing welfare for people who are in need, all of these are distinctively different. And in every case, our labor market, our arrangements for employment make working people much less secure and enable more people to be really in extreme poverty as compared to all the other high-income democratic nations I just mentioned. That's the big background. And until such time as that political economy, which of course is racialized in its impact, but basically it's about the impoverishment of working people, until that's transformed, America's always going to be an outlier. The American arrangements have a bandwidth of variation, right? So we've already seen that within the USA, northeastern states, as compared to southern states, have fewer people incarcerated, fewer people victims of homicide, they've got fewer guns. We also know that over time, there's been local developments that are varied. So, for example, New York State and New York City have succeeded in doing a couple of things. They've succeeded in reducing the number of people incarcerated. They've also improved police training and police accountability, meaning that fewer people are shot by the NYPD than was the case in the 1980s and 1990s. We've seen local initiatives in terms of reversing things like felon disenfranchisement. It used to be the case that pretty much everyone outside of Maine and Vermont who spent time in prison would lose the vote. That meant, of course, that over time, large numbers of people, particularly black people, people of color, would be disenfranchised. So there was a kind of gerrymandering of the vote that came through the criminal justice system. That's been subject to campaigns and political movements, and that's been reversed to some degree. So the possibility for variation and change within the US is there. But until such time as the big political economy story is changed, the US is always going to be an outlier in comparison. By the way, one assumption that we've been making in this conversation, is that the USA is like an advanced, high-income, liberal democratic nation that should be compared with Western Europe or with Canada, Australia, New Zealand. In some respects, the USA is more like South American nations. It's more like Argentina or Brazil or Ecuador or Guatemala. Our homicide rates are within the South American range, not within the European range. Compared to South American countries, maybe Chile has a lower rate than the USA, but other nations have much higher rates of homicide. So we kind of look more like a South American nation than we do like a Western European nation. And that's something we don't normally think of in terms of, our proud heritage of liberal democracy and constitutional government, but that's the case.
You don't technically need this car. You say that out loud to yourself. You say, I have no space. You say, I'm just looking. Then you click. Then you zoom in on photo number 87 and whisper, oh no. Then you text a friend, the one who always enables you. You say to yourself, this is the last one, knowing it is not. You don't need this car. But maybe, just maybe, this car needs you. Bring a trailer. It's never just a car.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du Norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify, spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I was really shocked. You mentioned about crime rates differing by region. I knew they differed, but I had no idea how much they differed. I mean, we're talking like the deep South rates are like 5 to 6 times that of the Northeast. That really stunned me. And I guess that would kind of fit into your argument about inequality and opportunities and that sort of thing, right?
And also about guns.
Yeah. Yeah. Much more of a gun culture in the South. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. That's a good point. So, if we can kind of take this a little further and look at some people on the kind of progressive far left who would say, well, the problem is that that prisons are inherently oppressive, and we really need to just move away from them almost entirely, this sort of abolitionist view. Now, I can't honestly quite understand how that would work in practice, but I know you've thought about it and you mentioned it in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, there's two different things. There's a progressive concern to reduce rates of incarceration, to use the prison less, to use alternatives more. There's also a concern to police less aggressively and maybe to restrict the range of functions that the police carry out. I mean, in this country, precisely because we don't have good social services or a decent welfare state at the local level, the police end up doing all sorts of things, from policing in schools to policing traffic to dealing with homeless people and people who've got mental health problems and so on. There's a big argument that says, look, in other nations, these extraneous problems are dealt with by other social services. The police should be restricted in what they do, focusing on crime. Similarly, in other nations, they use the prison much less often. They have community measures. They use fines more often. There are all sorts of other things it can do. So the idea of minimizing the use of police and prison, that makes perfect sense. That would bring the USA more into line with Canada or Australia or Western European countries. Abolitionism is something else. Abolitionism is the idea that we should have a nation without police or a nation without prisons. And that, I think, is a kind of a utopian idealism that a lot of people who are kind of sick and tired of our unreformable prison system and our unreformable police system say, look, these institutions, these agencies are beyond repair. It's a broken system. We need to sweep it away altogether. We need to abolish it. Now, that kind of thinking and that kind of motivation is kind of understandable. It's a kind of counsel of despair. And it's also utopian in the sense that we can have a world without prisons, a world without police. I do think, though, it's seriously unrealistic. I mean, it is the case that even the most highly developed, egalitarian, social democratic nation, Norway or Sweden or the Netherlands, they still have police, they still have prisons. It's hard to imagine a nation without police, let alone a nation like the USA, with its violent problems, its gun problems, its serious disorder, operating without police, without prisons. We could certainly improve the accountability and direct the activity of prisons, of police, much more carefully. We could supplement their activities with social services that would be better able to deal with all the other things that police do. We could use the prison much less frequently. But I think the idea of abolishing these institutions seems unrealistic. In the book, I give an argument for that, why that's the case. Basically, without police, in other words, without a kind of an enforcement mechanism, you make the law optional, right? You say, like, basically, this is the criminal law, and we prefer if you obey it, but if you don't, well, there's nothing we're going to do. Someone has to be the coercive apparatus that enforces the law. Similarly, in terms of how do we punish lawbreakers, in the past, we've used corporal punishment, capital punishment, banishment, and so on. All these things are now pretty much culturally unacceptable. But if we use fines or community measures or supervision and so on, all of these non-custodial measures require cooperation on the part of the person who's been convicted. In other words, you have to pay your fine, you have to show up for supervision. What happens when people don't cooperate? I mean, forget about the usual story about, well, what about Hannibal Lecter or the kind of like the demon, dangerous person? Don't they have to be locked up? Yes, they probably do. They're a small number of people. But what about people who refuse to comply? What do we do with them? Basically, in modern societies everywhere, custodial detention, which in the future could become, I don't know, electronic, it could be home detention. You could imagine technical fixes that improve how we imprison people. But it's hard to imagine a system that doesn't use incarceration in some degree. The question of the USA is not that we use it at all, it's that we use it for everything so extensively. And that one could easily imagine being reformed. By the way, if we were to abolish the police, rich people would simply have their own private policing as they currently do. And this would be a recipe for, making the lives and the security of poor people even more jeopardized than it currently is.
Yeah. Sounds like a really depressing sci-fi movie. I guess when I think about my takeaway, my ultimate takeaway from your book is that unless we make sort of fundamental changes to our political economy here in the United States, we're probably going to see much higher rates of violence and much higher rates of incarceration. That's pretty depressing because I don't see that happening. And so, but if we put that huge depressing bit aside just for a minute, when you look at what's in the realm of the potentially possible given American politics, American culture, is there anything you can look around at and see, well, this is maybe cause for at least some optimism?
Yeah, this is neither a country nor a time for glowing optimism about the near future. So the point you make is right, that basically my argument is that unless and until America's racialized political economy is fundamentally transformed, the USA will be a more violent and a more penal nation than others. I don't see that progressive transformation and move towards social democracy on the horizon politically anytime soon. So does that mean that we're stuck with the arrangements that we currently have? So I would say, no, it doesn't mean that. It means that there's an American bandwidth, as I describe it. Basically, what I mean by that is America's always going to be different from these other nations we've been comparing it to. But the patterns of policing and the patterns of prosecution and the patterns of punishment that exist in this country needn't be exactly the same as they are now. They're not the same as they were in 2008. They're not the same as they were in 1990. They've been changing, and they change in a variety of ways that I mentioned in the book. So, for example, police killings, police shootings, police behavior that's violent towards suspects and civilians, that can be governed and managed and trained in ways that improve police conduct. We know that because the NYPD, for example, a large urban police force, the largest one in the country, that's become better on these measures over time as a consequence of training and recruitment and accountability practices. It's still not great. It still doesn't compare to begin with these other nations, but it's better than it was. Similarly, we can incarcerate fewer people. We know that because, first of all, the whole nation incarcerates fewer people now than it did 15 years ago, but also because some particular places like New York State, like New York City, have taken major steps to reduce the number of people in prison and been able to do so without an increase in crime and violence occurring at the same time. In this country, we now detain many fewer youths in prison. Youth detention has really diminished over time, again, in ways that improve outcomes for young people, but in ways that haven't jeopardized levels of crime and violence. So these things can be improved. I mentioned earlier that one of the big features of the American penal system is the extent to which, even after they've served time in prison or been in jail, people who've been convicted often have other consequences in terms of fees and fines and restrictions that are placed on them. They lose the vote. They're not allowed to do certain kinds of jobs. They're not allowed to live in certain kinds of places. They've got to pay charges. All of these things can be challenged and reversed at the local level. We've seen that notoriously in the election where George Bush eventually was allowed to win. It turned out that Florida would have gone to his opponent had it been the case that so many felons hadn't been disenfranchised. A colleague of mine here, Jeff Manzer, wrote a book about that, Locked Out, describing how felon disenfranchisement had made a huge difference to the outcomes of federal elections. That mobilized people to challenge felon disenfranchisement. And in one state after another, these laws have been changed. People now can regain the vote after they leave custody, or they don't lose it in the first places. In other words, change within the American bandwidth is possible in a progressive direction. We know that because it's been done on a variety of fronts. But until such time as America becomes more like these other nations in terms of its basic economic and political system, it's always going to be the case that the USA is an outlier.
Yeah. Well, that's at least some optimism. And so I'll close on that at least semi-optimistic note. And I just want to say that it was a fascinating book. We only really scratched the surface. If you think you know about American policing, American punishment, I am sure you will find things in Law and Order Leviathan that you didn't realize. It was a great experience for me, and I'm just really glad to have had the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,